In this lecture, we explore one of the most important revolutions in the history of humanity and even of our planet, the transition from foraging to farming. Let me pose three questions to you that anthropologists and archaeologists have frankly struggled to answer for more than a century. Why would humans or did some humans in just a few places adopt farming and many others not? And what has the impact of the agricultural revolution been on human lifeways and on the biosphere? Okay, let's get back to the key questions of where, when, and why the transition to agriculture occurred. It appeared that this was not an abrupt change. The road from gathering plants in the wild, then cultivating and finally domesticating them was long and convoluted. Show us that humans were harvesting and eating wild cereals for thousands of years before actual domestication began. The shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, which was first settled 25,000 years ago, probably by Natufians, more than 10,000 years before farming began. But one problem with this theory is that agriculture appeared separately in different regions of the world that had no contact with each other. We also know that agriculture was not necessarily seen as a more attractive lifeway to foraging, as a better idea, because foraging persisted for millennia in close proximity to early farming communities. Skeletal remains also show that early farmers were not only subject to great levels of stress, but also to new diseases, many of which spread from domesticated animals to humans, a problem we still face today. The adoption of farming actually shortened human lifespans and increased infant mortality rates amongst early farming communities. So the brilliant idea theory, the appearance of some Paleolithic farming Einstein to explain the emergence of agriculture, simply will not work. An alternative approach, more widely accepted today, is to explain the agricultural revolution as a step-by-step process in which conscious human decision-making may have played only a limited role. The Holocene was not only warmer and wetter, but also more climatically stable. And as different groups experimented with domestication, they increased in size relative to foraging bands. Researcher Peter Richardson argues that this increase in group size led to intergroup competition, and this more or less forced communities to adopt farming. Now, building on the work of Richardson and many other specialists, Big History offers a 5-step model to try and explain the origins of agriculture. The first step is actually a precondition. Humans already had a lot of the necessary knowledge and skills for farming. Remember, for almost 200,000 years, humans had been endlessly manipulating other species and landscapes to enhance our food supply and to reduce our exposure to predators. Step 2 is another precondition, really. Some animal and plant species were also essentially pre-adapted as potential domesticates. Step 3 of the 5-step model to explain the transition to agriculture is that humans in certain key regions of the globe were already adopting less nomadic lifestyles and becoming at least part-time sedentary. Archaeological evidence shows us that sedentism began to increase in some parts of the world from about 11,000 years ago. A coincidence that the biblical Garden of Eden was probably located in Southwest Asia, in the fertile delta regions of the Tigris and Euphrates. The people who settled in these regions were not farming, just living off the abundant natural fruits of the land. But this increased sedentism eventually led to overpopulation because sedentary peoples do not have the same constraints on population growth that nomadic peoples do. Just as migrants moving between the two large American continents had to pass through Mesoamerica. And this at least partly explains the large and dense populations that eventually settled in these regions. Certainly by 10,000 years ago, there is archaeological evidence that these interregional migrations had led to localized population pressure, which forced people to migrate through and settle in smaller and smaller areas. Now, we learned in the context of the ancient city of Jericho about communities that, as a result of climate change, were able to abandon nomadism and adopt sedentism while still pursuing hunter-gathering lifeways. Such communities are termed affluent foragers. foragers who have access to sufficient resources that they can settle down and become sedentized. Evidence of affluent foraging has also been found in many other parts of the world. Because of affluent foraging then, particularly in the Fertile Crescent, population pressures resulting from sedentism and continuing migration forced human communities into smaller and smaller territories. By 13,000 BP, foragers were occupying a wide range of environmental niches all over the planet, and in some cases these niches could not support increased populations, as Peter Richardson's intergroup competition model indicates. These groups were forced to try and feed themselves off rapidly diminishing parcels of land, and with further migration not really an option, they found themselves caught in what we call the trap of sedentism, step 4 in this 5-step process. Remember, foraging lifeways are essentially nomadic in nature, requiring almost constant migration but once human groups became sedentary affluent foragers, these constraints on population growth simply disappeared. It was no longer necessary to leave old folks behind, and communities were able to support more children, so populations grew amongst affluent foraging groups. This led eventually to the problem of overpopulation, a problem that would have become even more acute if climate change made affluent foraging less sustainable. Certainly, all the Natufian sites provide evidence of sedentism and increasingly dense local populations, suggesting that there may eventually have been too many people to support by affluent foraging practices. Many communities were left with few alternative survival strategies. Because of continuing climate change and the resulting lack of space, a return to a nomadic foraging lifeway was impossible. And after many generations of affluent foraging, the skills of the nomadic hunter-gatherer may well have been lost. The only viable option available for affluent foragers faced with overpopulation pressure and climate change was to intensify cultivation and adopt farming. And that's exactly what appears to have happened at sites that could support large populations, such as Jericho, Jarmo in northeastern Iraq, and Çatalhöyük in Turkey. The final step in this model then, step 5, is the adoption of farming, the only remaining survival strategy available for these communities.